All right, so this week's Just-in-Time video looks at sustainable structures. In this chapter, there are three kinds of structures that the authors talk about, and I'm going to talk very quickly about each in turn. You're going to want to pay careful attention to what you're reading and think critically about how you could imagine each of these structures working. What would be some potential upsides? What would be some potential downsides? And I'm here to tell you there is no such thing as an ideal structure. There is no such thing as a structure that will work in every organization. Every organization occupies a unique context, and what's going to be best for a given organization is going to depend on that context. Now, when we talk about a sustainable structure, one of the key contingency variables that we're assuming is going to be true for organizations is that in order for them to be sustainable, they're going to have to respond to change. They're going to have to enact change and respond to it. So they need to have structures that are pretty loose, that are not at all mechanistic. In other words, they're not going to be focused around how do we ensure procedures, how do we ensure specialization. Instead, they're going to be more organic. All right? There are three different kinds, like I said, that Lawler and Worley briefly describe. But again, keep in mind, what each of these has in common is they're more organic, less mechanistic. So the first is what we can think of as a modified functional structure. Functional means that the divisions are oriented around functions such as accounting, finance, IT, HR, production, etc. Those are specific functions. You can think about it in the same way that many people in business schools, those tend to be majors or emphases. Okay, so those are functions. And in a functional structure, what departments or divisions care about, that would be the goals associated with their particular function. One of the challenges associated with this kind of structure is that it becomes really easy for people to sub-optimize. What that means is they tend to get focused around the goals of their department or their division and to sort of lose track or lose sight of the organization goals. They get very insulated from the rest of what's happening in the organization, and they get focused, as I said, on just their function. So Lawler and Worley talk about, or they introduce this concept of maximum surface area. And thinking about this is intended to help alleviate some of the issues that we see in typical functional structures where, again, everyone is only zeroed in on their particular function. So they say that organizations need a flatter structure. In other words, not lots and lots of layers, not a real tall chain of command. Instead, as flat as possible. That includes what I call boundary spanning roles. What those are, the organization and its environment, there's a boundary between the two. As people go between the organization and the environment, they're said to be occupying a boundary spanning role. Typical people who would be involved in boundary spanning, purchasing, these are folks who are having to interact both inside and outside the organization. Distribution, there again, people who are having to associate both inside and outside. Waste management, both inside and outside. Energy management, both inside and outside. Sales, both inside and outside. And in a typical functional structure, what doesn't end up interacting with the outside, with customers, for example, would be something like production, sometimes IT, sometimes HR. So they are buffered, if you will, from the external environment. Lawler and Worley are arguing that we need to eliminate those barriers between people and the external environment, between the people, for example, in production and external stakeholders, that we really want to try and make it possible for even someone on the production line to hear directly from a customer. That is in part supposed to enable the organization to be a little bit more agile, more nimble, more responsive. So that's its purpose. Now they have their rule of thumb. Nobody should be more than 2 connections away from a customer or a key stakeholder. Okay, whatever. Whether it's 2 people or 3 people. Again, what really matters here is we want there to be a strong connection between any one person in the organization and external stakeholders. Okay, we want to avoid buffering as much as possible. In terms of coordination and resource allocation systems within a functional structure, what we're trying to do is to get away from a focus on control and more interested in how can we flexibly allocate resources. So we talk about, formal systems of coordination and more informal systems of coordination. You've got things like setting goals, defining schedules, planning budgets, but you can also get much more complicated with project management, having matrix relationships, and so on. The bottom line for a sustainably managed organization is flexibility is key. We need to be able to move swiftly. We need to be, again, those words, agile, flexible, nimble. We can't get caught up in structures and policies and procedures where the goal is, okay, we want to stabilize everything so we can maximize efficiency. That's the antithesis of what we're interested in. So one of the characteristics of organizations that perhaps most effectively ensures rigidity is the annual budget. So each division or department is given its allocation. This is what you need to, these are the means within which you need to live. This is what you're expected to produce if there's a revenue side to the equation. This is all the money you have for salaries, for supplies and equipment, et cetera, et cetera. That's all predicated on the notion that we can somehow see into the future and know exactly how much resource we're going to need over the course of the next year. That assumes that we know everything we're going to be doing over the next year. And perhaps even more deadly, many organizational budgets, they're not base-built budgets. They, in fact, are carryovers from previous years. So the underlying assumption is that which made sense historically will continue to make sense in the future. And Lawler and Worley are arguing that, that's not at all how a sustainably managed organization needs to work. So we need to think about something other than traditional budgeting techniques. They also talk in this section about the need for transparent decision making. And this is an area where I think technology can be a great enabler. Who is involved in offering input? How is that input considered? Who has access to input and so on? Again, we're trying to maximize the surface area. Wherever information, good ideas, valuable, wherever it is, we want to be able to tap into it. So we don't want to get hung up on traditional hierarchy where, in a traditional hierarchy, there's this presumption that as you go higher, people are smarter and that they have better access to knowledge and expertise. And Lawler and Worley are arguing that, not only is that an old-fashioned way of thinking about the world, but it's a pretty inaccurate way of thinking about the world, that in truth, people all throughout the organization will have valuable information that we want to input into our decision-making processes. So again, we want to, in this modified functional structure, sort of keep those old functional divisions that people find very comfortable, but make it better. So, it's like a better brand of peanut butter, basically. It's still peanut butter, but it's maybe a little bit healthier for you, maybe tastes a little bit better. But it still has a lot of the problems of the more traditional functional structure. For example, the fact that people will often suboptimize. They'll be focused on their division or the department goals and not the overall organization. They'll start to think that they're the only ones who really understand how things work. The people in sales, we're the only ones who really understand what customers care about. The people in production, we're the only ones who really care about quality, and so on. So this is not, in fact, an ideal structure for most organizations. The second one, what Lawler and Worley call ambidextrous, is really, let's keep the old, okay, because that enables us to be efficient. But let's also have a component in our organization where we do innovation, where we're not tied to the old-fashioned hierarchy, where we're not cued into all those rules, those policies and procedures. A term that you'll probably have heard that you might recognize is Skunk Works. So it's still part of the organization, but it's a place where the old-fashioned rules don't apply. Okay? So the things that we've been doing forever and ever and that we can see we're going to keep doing, let's use maybe a functional structure. Let's use a functional structure. And then those divisions, those departments can specialize, get really good at what they're doing. Awesome. We can be efficient. And then for the innovation piece, let's have this separate. Okay. I want you to think hard about the kinds of issues that might create. How'd you like to be in the old-fashioned focus on efficiency area where change is something that's resisted, perhaps even by the top-level managers? Wouldn't it be almost more interesting, at least some of the time, to be allowed to be innovative? Something to consider. All right. The last one is the network organization. Now, the network organization is predicated on the idea that organizations, in truth, are networks of relationships. We impose a hierarchy on top of what we might call the informal structure of relationships. And depending on the organization, that formal hierarchy gets paid attention to or not. And I would argue that in most organizations, that informal network of relationships is incredibly important. The example I always give is, when I need something done in another department, I could work my way through the chain, up, over, and so on. Or if I've developed some good personal relationships within the workplace with people in those other departments, maybe I just call them directly because I know them and they're part of my informal network. Okay, what Lawler and Worley are talking about essentially is, let's not just let that be informal. Let's try to get rid of the hierarchy and instead just allow people to operate as though everything is a network of relationships. Now, to do this is a challenge. First of all, people have to let go of their affection for hierarchy. And let me assure you, many people love hierarchies because they enable them to have what they consider to be important power. They love hierarchy because it simplifies life. Hey, this is who I report to. I only have to listen to this person. I don't have to listen to anybody else. When it all becomes about managing relationships without some formalized hierarchy imposed, this requires all of us to use communication better, to be more politically astute, we're always sort of being held accountable for what do we know, what can we bring to a particular project, for example, what are our skills. We don't get assigned to things just because we belong to a given department. That's a hierarchical model. Instead, we get asked, invited to be on projects because we've got the skills that are needed to make that project work. Now, can that kind of structure work? Yes, it can. I guarantee it. However, as is true with all structures, there are some key contingency variables that need to be considered when weighing whether this kind of structure is going to work. Number one, how will people access information? Is it easily accessible? Can everyone access it? Do they know how to access it? That's key. Number two, what kind of expertise do people have? Do individuals have? What kind of development is provided, or what do they have access to continually enhance, develop, grow their skill base so that they can continue to be valuable? Okay, that's important. Number three, are these people who want to make decisions? Not everybody does. Let's make sure we're hiring, selecting, keeping, etc., people who enjoy making decisions, because you've got to be a pretty independent, critical thinker to operate well in a network structure. The bottom line for this chapter is as follows. The modified functional structure is the one that most people will find comfortable. It's probably also the one that will least lead to a sustainable organization. The other two, the ambidextrous and the network structure, most likely to lead to a sustainable, effective, long-term future for the organization and its people, but a whole lot harder for people to sort of wrap their heads around. It's just very new in ways that they maybe haven't even learned about in school. So it presents what I consider an interesting challenge. And that's it for Chapter 6. Thanks.